This is Lecture 7B, Motor Cortex. The objectives of this lecture are to describe the location of the motor strip, state the components of the pyramidal system, describe the functions of the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts, state the difference between the pyramidal tract and the extrapyramidal tracts, define decussation and state innervation patterns, and finally describe clinical correlates. The primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. The primary motor cortex contains BET cells, which are a type of pyramidal cell that is important for voluntary motor movement. The functional organization is represented by the homunculus, with disproportionate representation for the face and mouth because of the intricacy of functions and movements associated with these areas. So looking at these pictures, the first one to your right, you see that the primary motor cortex is represented by Brodmann's area 4. And of course the primary motor cortex is anterior to the central sulcus, so we're in the frontal lobe. And then in schematic A, we just have the words for various areas, which are innervated, or for which the fibers originate in the primary motor cortex for various areas in the body. So motor neural impulses originate from the primary motor cortex on 25 to 30% of fibers, the premotor cortex about 30% of fibers, and then the primary sensory cortex 40% of fibers. So the efferents project to contralateral limbs. There are vertically organized neuronal columns from the brain surface to the depth of the cortex, and each of these columns is responsible for a group of muscles. So motor control is enhanced by the inhibitory effect of the basal ganglia and excitatory effect of the cerebellum, which we talked about in Lecture 7A. Motor control is also enhanced by feedback from adjacent cortical and subcortical areas that assist with planning and reasoning and spatial aspects. The pyramidal tracts pass through the pyramids of the medulla. So there are two tracts, the corticospinal tracts, which are aggregations of upper motor nerve cells, fibers rather, that travel from the cerebral cortex and terminate in the spinal cord. And then the other tracts are the corticobulbar tracts, which are aggregations of upper motor nerve fibers that travel from the cerebral cortex and terminate in the brainstem. The corticospinal tracts conduct impulses from the brain to the spinal cord. And again, these are involved in voluntary movement. The corticospinal tracts are made up of lateral and anterior tracts, which we've discussed previously. The majority of fibers cross over in the medulla, resulting in muscles being controlled by the opposite side of the brain. And then this schematic just simply shows the corticospinal tract with decussation at the level of the medulla. So the left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain. When thinking about the corticospinal tracts, then the axons that cross over move to the outer part of the medulla and form the lateral corticospinal tract. Fibers that do not cross over in the medulla form the anterior corticospinal tract. Nerve axons of the lateral corticospinal tract that did not cross over in the medulla do so at the level of the spinal cord in which they terminate. Nerve axons traveling down the tract are referred to as upper motor neurons, and these synapse with interneurons which then synapse with lower motor neurons in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. The corticobulbar tracts travel along with the corticospinal tract through the internal capsule. Corticobulbar tracts are of particular interest to speech-language pathologists because the corticobulbar tracts control facial, oral, and associated muscles through cranial nerves. The corticobulbar tracts terminate in a number of locations in the brainstem. Upper motor neurons in the corticobulbar tract synapse with interneurons or directly with lower motor neurons located in the motor cranial nerves. The corticobulbar tract has projections from the motor cortex and adjacent area to regulate skeletal muscles of the head and face through the cranial nerves. These course through the internal capsule and pes pedunculi. The corticobulbar tracts cross midline at multiple points, so that's unlike the corticospinal fibers, which for the most part cross in the medulla. The corticobulbar tracts also have different innervation patterns, so that we know that there's contralateral innervation, but there are also cranial nerves which have bilateral innervation. So for example, that would include cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, cranial nerve 10, the vagus, and cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal. And then this schematic is just showing the corticobulbar tract and then showing how there is decussation at various levels of the brainstem. So for example, cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, crosses at the level of the midbrain, in contrast to the cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal, which crosses over at the level of the medulla. So again, there's contralaterality to input and output. So if the lesion is above the level of pyramidal decussation, the signs are contralateral to the site of lesion. If the lesion is below the level of decussation, the signs or deficits are ipsilateral to the site of the lesion. A couple of clinical correlates then would include unilateral corticobulbar lesions. So we've talked a little bit about this in class, that if there is bilateral innervation, say the cranial nerve 10, the vagus, there's an upper motor neuron lesion, there's a less profound impact on laryngeal muscles because of the bilaterality of innervation. So if there's a lesion, an upper motor neuron lesion on the left, although those tracts would be impaired, the contralateral and ipsilateral tracts, the tracts on the right, which are both ipsilateral and contralateral, would be preserved. However, if there are bilateral corticobulbar lesions, there will be a profound impact on cranial nerve functioning. Thinking in terms of some terms just related to motor function, in terms of paralysis patterns, monoplegia refers to weakness of one limb, hemiplegia affects 1/2 of the body, triplegia affects 3 limbs, and quadriplegia would mean that all 4 limbs, both arms and both legs, are involved. Upper motor neuron lesions and lower motor neuron lesions result in a different constellation of symptoms. So upper motor neuron lesions would result in spasticity, increased tone, hyperreflexia, and paralysis, in contrast to lower motor neuron lesions, that would result in a flaccid paralysis, decreased tone, hyporeflexia, and muscle atrophy. Spastic hemiplegia results from an upper motor neuron lesion. This might be due to a stroke, a brain tumor, or some degenerative diseases. And because we're talking about an upper motor neuron lesion, then we would see increased tone, so hypertonia, hyperreflexia, and what's called clasp knife rigidity. Another clinical correlate is pseudobulbar palsy. So this is a condition in which there's bilateral involvement of the corticonuclear pathways. So these patients have a bilateral spastic paralysis of speech muscles, and then a very characteristic strong response to emotional stimuli where there's excessive laughter or excessive crying relative to a sad or happy circumstance, or sometimes there's an emotional response in the absence of any apparent stimuli. Alternating hemiplegia refers to a condition in which a brainstem lesion affects the ipsilateral cranial nerve motor nuclei and a contralateral hemiplegia. So there are lower motor neuron signs for the face, tongue, pharynx, larynx, and eyes, but upper motor neuron signs for the extremities. Upper motor neuron syndromes involve a loss of voluntary movements in the affected muscles. There is initially flaccidity associated with upper motor neuron syndromes, but this eventually becomes spastic, and there's increased tone because of contralateral sprouting. So again, there are hyperactive reflexes and increased muscle tone in upper motor neuron syndromes. Damage to the upper motor neuron can result in hyperactive anti-gravity stretch reflexes and spastic muscle tone, in contrast to damage to the lower motor neuron cell or axon that eliminates the entire function of the motor unit. So I think I used the term in class, the final common pathway. So damage to the lower motor neuron results in muscle atrophy because there is no innervation to a muscle group as a result of a lower motor neuron lesion.